Yo, what's going on, guys? Boy Young Tech. Let me guess something. You might have watched web development tutorials that show JavaScript programming in it, and then you saw something called document.getElement or document.querySelector. If you're not, and you haven't learned what it is, I suggest you stick to the video till the end because this is one of the first things you need to learn in JavaScript web programming. In this video, I'm gonna explain what are those two things, what do they use for, and why are they important. So firstly, you can easily know it just by reading the get element and selector. So it basically tells the program to take an element or to select an element with a particular attribute value. Since there are multiple attributes that we can put in an element, after get element, there are a few options you can apply. Most of the times, it's gonna be either get element by ID or querySelector. Well, actually, beside element by ID, there are also element by class name, elements by name, elements by tag name, elements by tag name, but tag name ain't asked. But in this right now, I'm just gonna discuss about get element by ID and also querySelector, because those are the ones that select a single element and the rest of the other methods select multiple elements at once. Without making it more complicated, let me just demonstrate how it works. So let me delete all of these, and I've set up a basic files in here, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and I've made the document codes, and I've put a basic stylings in it, and then see it and to preview decide the page, we can just go for the live server. Then you can see this is how it looks. So nothing is working, and the button is not working. And if you see in here, this input is this one. It has the value of 0 because I've put a value of 0 in it. And I'm not gonna talk about the HTML and CSS in depth because this is a JavaScript tutorial, but I just want to give you a simple overview of what is happening. And also, I assume that you've learned HTML, not CSS, HTML, pure HTML, because if you haven't, there's no way you can understand what is this document.getElement by ID. So, as you know, when you learn HTML, you can put an ID in pretty much every element exists in the HTML. I've put an ID for the button, but I haven't put an ID for the input, so I'm just gonna put it right away. The ID of, let me say this is gonna be a number. Hit save, and let's go to JavaScript. And by the way, I've connected the script.js to the HTML by using a script tag with a source of the file's name, and then with the attribute of reverse, so that the JavaScript will apply after all this code. So it's the same as putting the JavaScript tag at the end. Go to the JavaScript, and then let's delete this nonsense. So firstly I want to talk about what is document about. So it refers to the document file, web document file, and in this case it is obviously the HTML. It would also include files like XML, SVG, and any other document files. In some cases it might be PDFs, but it's not important right now. What I wanted to know is that what its connection with HTML. So document refers to HTML, specifically refers to the parent node, and I want to make sure that everything inside it in this code exists inside the document file. So I'm gonna write document for the parent node, and then the selector method I'm gonna use get element by ID, because like I said, it selects a single element and there's only one input element in the HTML. So uh, because I want to select the input, and the input has given an ID of a number, so you just need to put a number. Usually, if you have learned styling with CSS, you're gonna need a what is it, like a hashtag for to in order to select an ID. But because you have set it to by ID, so JavaScript knows that this is an ID, so you don't need to use a hashtag to recognize an ID anymore. So after that, actually, this is not efficient. In the next line of codes, I want to make this simple. So therefore, I'm gonna assign to a variable. Let me just name it num. So num is 100% the same as this. The only difference is that how is it represented? This is represented in a specific way, and this one is represented in a variable. Now, obviously, I gotta show you what to do with it. Otherwise, no matter how hard I try to explain it, this video would be a waste of time. But before we get into that, I want you to understand the fundamental of modifying an element, an object. This is called object destination. Not sure what people call it, but I personally call it object destination. So if you see an element, let me get into the HTML. So for example, we have the input element right here. So one element consists of different attributes, just such as ID type, class, value, sometimes a lot more. And then, for instance, we want to change, we want to modify something in the input element, and we have assigned the input element to a variable called num based on the ID. So, for example, the num is basically the same as the input in here. So you might think that we can just put input equals something that you want to change. But the problem is programming languages don't read mind. They don't read your brain. They don't know what you think. What they do is they're programmed. They're told to do something that's written on the lines. So don't expect them to know what you think. You tell them what to do. Now, so let's get into object destination. Like I said, if you, oh, excuse me, I mean, this is if you only put the object without any specific destination, this reverts to the variable itself. So if suppose I change the num to let me see, I'm gonna give a string of testing, and then I can go up to the console log num, and then if you go to the console, it'll show an error because like it says encode type error, constant variable. So you can't do this. And now let's get into exactly how to decide the destination. In JavaScript, only JavaScript, I'm not sure with the other programming languages, but in JavaScript, if you put a variable or an object, you gotta put a period, and then you decide what do you want from it, like what do you want to change in it. And sometimes it's not just what it has, but sometimes you can give, or you can put more programs, like you can add event listener to add a event into the input to the element. But for now, let me just go to let me say style. So style refers to the styling, CSS, you know what I'm saying? And then style. Let's go for, let me say font size maybe. Font size, and then font size string. So font size is gonna be 50. Yeah. Now let's see. Now this is ridiculous, but this is just what happened. So, and then we can also change the value. So the value, it doesn't show in the abbreviation, doesn't show in the whatever you call this, snippets or whatever. And then the value, I'm gonna change the value to 5. Therefore, the value will be 5. And I want you to explore more about this object destination by road. Now for these two destinations, we have these two properties, inner HTML and inner text. So this is basically what's inside, what's in the middle of the tag. But since input is a single tag element, so there is no way you can change anything in these two. But if it's a text, just like H1, headings and paragraphs, you can definitely use it to change the text. We also have add event listener. So this basically means that you're putting an event, just like let me say click. So every time you click the input, it'll do something, and what it does is what you write in here. In here. And then if you want to add a class, the element, you can go for a class list, add, and the class name, and view ID. You can give an ID. There is no ID list because each ID can only be assigned to an element, so there is no way that elements can share the same ID. If it does, it'll select the first element. But I don't recommend this because you've set the ID. I mean, you took the element using the ID, so if you change it, it basically change anything in the next lines. So that's pretty much it. What you need to know about changing element, how to modify it, how to add it. Let's get into querySelector. But before we get into that, I want to give a quick announcement to you guys. We have officially launched our merch on Teespring. We provide a lot of products, a lot of types of products specifically, and you can choose whatever you want. You can buy a hoodie, you can buy a mat for if you like yoga, and then there's a shirt for men and women. So you can basically find what you like the most in here. And the quote looks simple, but the question is, can you do it? What I want you to think every time you see this text, I want you to realize how great you are, and obviously to motivate you every time you're working on something. Let's get back to the JavaScript, and now we have const num document.querySelector. So a querySelector basically, you can select an element by class, like element by its own name, like input, and then class ID and its own name. So it selects an element just like how you select an element in the CSS. So for ID, you gotta start with a hashtag, and for a class, you need to start with a period. And since class can be shared with multiple elements, the query selector will select first element that has this particular class. Why doesn't it just select all the classes? I mean, all the elements that have this class? Because query selector only selects one element. So what's the difference between query selector and query selector all? querySelectorAll returns node list. So it's like multiple elements, multiple objects. So it obviously doesn't work for the input because there's only one input in here. But since we have two buttons, I'm gonna use the button as the example. So this is the button. If you want to change anything on it, you just can't change it. Let me go for the inner HTML because it doesn't even want to show the snippets because it has multiple elements inside it. Let me say console log num. You see node list. There are two elements inside it, the first button and the second button. In JavaScript, the first list starts with a 0. So 0 means the first object. So the first one has the ID of decrement and the second one is increment. And you definitely can't just change its value, its attribute by just selecting all of them. So in order to do that, first of all, let me just change it into buttons. So we have a method called forEach. So it selects each of the object inside it, and then we can go for the parentheses. Each element I'm gonna call a button, and after that we can give a function, and now we decide what to do with it. So let me say I'm gonna change this here. The button inner HTML. Now it'll show the snippets because it knows what it is. So in HTML, I'm gonna change it to plus. Obviously, this should be a string. Okay, plus. And for as you can see, this is decrement. So there's why would we put plus on it? So if you remember that the decrement is the first element, and first element starts with a 0 in JavaScript. We can select it by using the JavaScript index. What it is just the same as like 0, 1, 2, 3, like an order in JavaScript that starts with a 0. That we call it index in JavaScript. Now buttons. So I want to select the first element, which is 0. So I'm going to say 0 and dot inner HTML equals to class. There you go. So that's it guys for this video. I hope you learned a lot. Don't forget to check out our merch on Teespring. The link is in the description. Also check our Patreon. We conducted giveaways in there and you'll get additional special benefits for becoming our patron. Share this video to spread the knowledge and turn on the notification just to update it. It's your boy Jay from Young Tech. See ya.